The Halo Infinite technical preview just wrapped up over this past weekend, and it gave us our first look at what Halo Infinite's multiplayer could be. Now, if you've been a fan of Halo, chances are you were a fan of the Bungie era, but has 343 finally nailed Halo, or is Halo Infinite going to turn into another Halo 5 dumpster fire? Let's find out. Hey, I'm Sam with Busy Dad Gaming. I help busy dads figure out what Xbox and PC games to play so they can relax and go back to their families recharged. When Halo Infinite comes out this holiday season, it's going to come out on Game Pass day one. Now, for most people, Halo isn't going to be a thing where it's both money and time because it's part of Game Pass. So it's going to be costing them just their time. But the real question ends up becoming whether or not Halo is actually going to be worth their time. So over this past weekend, Halo Infinite technical preview gave us our first glimpse into whether or not Halo Infinite will actually be worth our time or not. When 343 took over Halo from Bungie, and it was an interesting shift. Bungie was really pushing the story and the narrative, and they were showing as opposed to telling in game. And so a big focus was just on the overall game and the multiplayer sandboxes. Now 343 didn't take this same methodology when it took over. 343 Halo games, they looked great, but they didn't feel like Halo. The story was told across a lot of different mediums. You had games, podcasts, videos, books, etc., which meant you could miss something or not get the whole picture when you played through a game. I loved the Hunt for the Truth podcast as an example, which got into the Guardians more in depth, but in game it wasn't. So overall, in my personal opinion, Halo has struggled since Reach and the Bungie era. Now, after this technical preview, Halo finally feels like Halo, but more modernized. Now, the movement felt like a mix of Halo and COD, but more so Halo than COD. You could sprint, which was, from what I understand based on other people's calculations, was roughly about 9% faster than your normal run. But when you did run, you ended up showing up on the radar, and the radar was a little bit different this time around. But you could also slide, you could jump, you could slide into a jump, you could vault. The other thing that really felt great was the weapons. They felt really tight. The only caveat to this was probably the plasma pistol, but I've never been a fan of that gun anyway, so that's probably biased there. But the Commando was one of my favorite guns. It felt like it could use a little bit of a buff, but man, when that thing shot, it sounded like it was doing damage. Now, the grapple hook was seriously awesome to play with, and I'm really curious to see all the different ways that the community ends up playing with the grapple hook. The items in game overall, like the overshield, the camo, the drop shields, they all feel really good, and I'm really glad they're pickups and they're not something that you just magically start with. Now, the maps finally were really done well. And this is something from a COD perspective that I've had criticisms over, is that the maps felt bland. And in this particular technical preview, finally, this 3-lane map layout feels good. Even though it's technically an arena, the overall feel of these maps felt really good. There's little nooks and crannies that you can go through. There's different verticalities within the particular maps. Overall, they just felt really good. Now, the other really big piece of it was the customization, and overall it felt really good from a customization standpoint, where you can go ahead and have full sets applied, or you could have just individual things applied, and you can even add prosthetics. So overall, I'm really curious to see when this actually fully rolls out, how many different customizations and how we can mix and match to make our Spartans our own. But for now, I'm really happy with the direction the customizations are taking. Now, I've also said this before, but the sound design in this game is amazing. Now, from a Halo orchestra perspective, you had the title screen. It felt like Halo as soon as you dropped into it. You had the menu song that was going. You had the songs that were in game. And you had the actual sound design itself when you were in the game itself. So you had the sounds of running, you had the grunts and the throws and the shots. Everything felt really good. Granted, you had the bugs that were present, and most of them were audio related, but by and large, great experience. It feels like this is my biggest thing that I can say for this game, is it finally feels like Halo, but modernized. Now, again, as I mentioned before, there are some improvements that could be made here, and the first one I'm going to point out is the bots. Now, when I first started playing against them, the Spartan level was relatively easy. ODST cranked up that notch. It was like a really big difference in difficulty, but once you got the hang of them, it was relatively easy again. And then the difference between ODST and Spartan, one, I honestly really couldn't tell. Maybe they jumped a little bit more and maybe they threw more grenades, but by and large, I really couldn't tell. From a difficulty perspective, that's one side of it I think that they can get better on. The other piece is that sometimes they just stopped playing. Is this as if the AI script just like, okay, I'm gonna take a break here for a moment, and it just stops. So the bot would actually stop, or they would sit there and they would shoot at a wall, or they would go ahead and start staring at the sky just asking to die. It was really interesting, and I'm really curious to see how they improve, and those could be, as the devs have mentioned, a really great way to warm up before you start playing some PvP. The other big complaint that I had really, again, was around the sound design, but the bugs. I am pretty sure this is gonna get, resolved before any of this stuff actually goes to production, but the key piece was that most of the bugs I did encounter were sound related. So whenever you loaded into a game mid-match, you had no music, and the mix was really weird. So for example, your running was really pronounced and loud, your grunts and your firing was really loud, but other stuff like the more ambient sounds were really low or even ducked against. The overall mix was very weird. The other thing is sometimes the sounds would get trapped in a loop, and so you'd end up hearing the same voice over and over and over again for the entire match. That was super irritating, especially with some of those AI voices, but by and large, there weren't a ton of negatives here. I'm really curious to see how things progress and seeing how they take all this information that they got over this technical preview and apply it. It was to a 2-month-old build, so they're going to take a lot of those findings and start to bring it back into the main build, but I'm really happy with the direction Halo is finally taking. So going forward, I'm really looking forward to the next public flight that'll end up taking place. They haven't announced when that's going to happen, but I'm finally excited for a Halo game, and I can't tell you how good that feels. Make sure to check out the recommended video for you, and I'll see you in the next video.